Welcome, everyone. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. Thrilled to be with you today for the virtual reading group. Since we're talking about common sense and reality and the thinking ego today, I should say I'm not at Bard College today. I'm in Buenos Aires in Argentina. So hopefully the internet at this hotel will cooperate, and I'm hoping we get through the session today. Um, but it's a pleasure to be here with you as always on Fridays, and look forward to the discussion. We are, as you all know, in the midst of reading Hannah Arendt's Life of the Mind. Um, we are reading the critical edition of The Life of the Mind, which just came out this year. We just had a conference on it up at Bard last week, and we have we did a radio show at Radio Kingston, where I do a monthly radio show on it as well. And if Yana can, maybe she'll put a link to that radio show in the chat at some point. It was a great show, and we got to hear from three of the editors of the volume about some of the innovations of this particular edition of the Life of the Mind, and also their interpretations of the Life of the Mind. So I think it would be quite interesting, and we can put that episode in the chat. It will at some point come out on the Reading Hannah Arendt podcast as well as a podcast. In any case, today we are readings in chapter 1, sections 6 and 7. There's some of you who are attentive readers probably noticed that there are two section 7s in chapter 1. It's a bit of a mystery. So in the typescript that Hannah Arendt was working on, that was supposed to be complete for the whole book 1 on thinking, there are two section 7s. What it looks like, since it's two different typewriters, is that her secretary had typed up a long section 7, and in the middle of it, Hannah Arendt writes section 7 and the same title again, the thinking ego and the sensus communis. Um, and it's not clear exactly. I don't think anyone knows. I've talked to the editors; they don't know. It's not entirely clear what Arendt meant. If she meant that these two sections were going to be combined at some point in the next draft, or was this section 7B, or I don't know. No one of us will know. Unfortunately, we'll probably never know. But we will try and make sense of section 6 and 7 today. And obviously in the Mary McCarthy edition, she sort of just mushes them together and combines them. But one of the virtues, at least supposed virtues, and I think it is a virtue of the critical edition, is it gives us what Arendt actually left us. And that often leaves us with questions, and we have to address those. In any case, just to remind ourselves where we are in this book, The Life of the Mind, Arendt is framing this basic question, right, which is, can the activity of thinking as such be amongst the conditions that make man abstain from doing evil, or even condition them against it? That's sort of one of the overriding questions of the book. And to anticipate, she writes in the introduction, in a nutshell, that the need of reason, another way of saying thinking, is not inspired by the quest for truth, but by the quest for meaning. And truth and meaning are not the same. And so we are now put into a clear frame of mind that this book is not about truth. It's amazing how much of Arendt's work is not about truth, right? In the essay Truth and Politics, what she wants to say is that politics is not about truth either. It's about opinion, and it's about building a common world. here, thinking is not about truth. It's about meaning. And what is meaning? Well, she says that meaning is an elusive word, much more elusive than the word truth, even, which might even be thought to be an elusive word. Um, and so we have to keep in mind that this whole text is an attempt to uh, um, think about the search for meaning at the core of the life of the mind and especially of thinking. Uh, Book one is on thinking, right? There's three books: thinking, judging, thinking, willing, and judging. She never finishes the book judging, but we'll talk about it at the end. But book one is on thinking, and the first part of book one is called appearance. Um, this, of course, uh, uh, makes us aware of a fundamental problem, which is that thinking generally doesn't appear, right? Thinking withdraws. Um, it's hard to see thinking. What is thinking? Um, you know, uh, there's a funny story. I probably shouldn't tell it, but what the hell? When I first started the Hannah Arendt Center and we applied for a grant at the National Endowment for the Humanities, um, they said, "Oh, we really like what you're doing, but we don't understand if you're really a humanities center." And I said, "Oh, what's the problem?" And they said, "Well, the center was at that point called the Hannah Arendt Center for Ethical and Political Thinking," and they said, "Well, we're not sure thinking has anything to do with the humanities." You can imagine my surprise at this claim. And they say, I mean, of course, people in the humanities think, but we don't understand what thinking is and how it relates to the humanities in sort of like a special way. And I was sort of shocked and didn't know how to respond. But of course, I said, so if you mean if I change the name to the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities, we'll get the grant? And they said, well, we wouldn't want to say that, but it might help. And of course, that's what happened. In any case, I think it's a funny story. It's an embarrassing story. Um, but it does get to the difficulty in understanding thinking and taking thinking seriously, because thinking doesn't seem to be anywhere. Um, and so she says the problem is that thinking doesn't appear. Now, in traditional metaphysics, that's not so much of a problem because we think of being above appearing. Uh, and therefore thinking, which might be thought to be not appearing but being, would be higher than appearing. But Arendt inverts that hierarchy, following a kind of interesting impetus from the biologist and botanist, I mean zoologist and botanist, Adolf Portman. And she says that, thinking, metaphysics, the laws of nature, create general rules and they turn us away from multiplicity and plurality, right? Um, they turn us away from the colors of the peacock's tail, and they just say the peacock tail, is there for to attract a mate, and they provide banisters to make the world functional and understandable, but they take away a lot of the color and the uniqueness of the world. And she says that the danger of thinking only about rules and general rules and thinking and being is that we forget the values of the things themselves. Um, and we forget that, in that the appearance of things actually matters. How I present myself, how you present yourself, how we look, how we approach, how we smell, how we smile, and that these are part of the story of each of us. That means that each of us appears in a way that is not who we are, right? In some deeper inner sense, whatever that would mean. And thus we all have errors or accidents, as Aristotle would put it. There's accidents in reality. Um, uh, uh, and yet, Arendt thinks that this appearance is actually who we are. It's the fullness of who we are. So could it be, she says, that there's an illusory thing like thinking, um, which can't appear, and where appearance is really the fullness of life, Could it be that this illusory thing called thinking, which doesn't appear, is actually still meaningful? Um, and how does thinking appear at all, or is it fit to appear at all? And so she talks about how there's a difference between the mind and the soul, right? Where the mind can be expressed in metaphor, thinking can appear expressed in metaphor in the mind, right? When we think about our feelings, our anger or our joy, we express them in words or in metaphors. Um, Yana, can you just mute everyone? Thank you. When we think about our feelings, we express them in language and in metaphor. But the actual anger or joy is beyond language or metaphor. It comes up in gestures and our looks and things that are not expressible in language. And she says the soul, where these feelings are, overflows into the body, right? The key difference is that in the mind, we choose what to present to people in language. So, whereas fear everybody has, courage is a choice. It's a thoughtful decision. Courage is a semblance, she says. And as a semblance, it's subject to hypocrisy, right? I can claim to be courageous, but not actually be courageous. Um, and so she says there are what the only thing that makes me courageous is not that I am in some metaphysical sense courageous. It's that my claim of courageous is something I actually actualize in appearance, in reality. Um, and so she says that courage, therefore, is a kind of authentic semblance. It is a semblance. It's something I choose to present. It's not real in the sense of metaphysical, but it's something I choose to present to the world. And such authentic semblances, um, she says, are meaningful and they are inherent in the world of appearances. They're unavoidable. You can't live in a world without such authentic semblances. And it's just such a kind of authentic semblance that she thinks is what she calls the thinking ego. And so, if the question is, well, can thinking help us? Well, okay, how to, our world is a world of appearance, not a world of being. How does thinking appear? Right. Well, okay, it appears as a semblance, as an illusion, not as something real, right? And yet she says she wants to say it's going to be an authentic semblance. And to understand that, she turns to Immanuel Kant, the great thinker of appearance and semblance. For those of you who have read a little Kant, or if you haven't, you may have heard of what's called the thing in itself, das Ding an sich. Um, the Ding an sich is the thing in itself that never appears, right? It doesn't appear, but it's necessitated by appearance and by the needs of human reason. So when you see um, when you see a hat, right? Yeah, you see the hat. It's a strange looking hat. I get that. Um, but there has to be something that caused that hat to appear. I mean, the philosopher Leibniz, writing about 100 years before Kant, says, look, there has to be a non-material cause because, okay, yes, someone knitted the hat or sewed the hat and it was fabric and they needed a hat because they wanted to cover their head, blah blah blah. You can go back and back and back, and there'll never be a first cause. There'll never be a first material cause. And Leibniz says, but if there's going to be a cause, there has to be some non-material cause, some super sensible cause, because otherwise you just keep going back and back and back. There's never a first cause. And so there has to be that first cause. And Kant has a similar idea. He says God doesn't appear, right? You can't see God, but we think about God. And he says to think about God is inherent in human thinking insofar as reason necessarily transcends the cognitive faculties, right? If you're going to ever, you know, our reason is always going to move beyond the material or the cognitive, and move towards some sort of transcendent first cause, God in this case. Well, what makes me able to do this and move my hands up and down? Well, freedom. Well, what is freedom? You never see freedom, right? Just like you never see God. And yet somehow humans think about these things. And she wants to say it's not an accident. It's inherent in our human thinking that we need to think beyond um, the cognitive and beyond the material. Um, and yet, when we think beyond the material and the cognitive, um, we can't know it. We can't know what freedom is. Can't know God because we can only know what appears. And there's a reason for that, she thinks, which is that I only can know something insofar as other people look at it and know it as well. And there's some sort of agreement. People look at the hat and they say, well, it's weird, but it's still a hat. And we agree it's a hat. And therefore I can know it's a hat. Um, so she says that thoughts and reason, things that are not material, they are, and ideas like God, freedom, and immortality are things, but they never appear. Um, and for humans, we have to think them. We can't help but think them, and yet we can never know them. And so this raises the question: are there thoughts that don't appear, right? Like justice, courage, immortality, freedom, but that are still given in the very understanding of the world as a world of appearances? That even though they don't appear, and even though we can never know them, a world of appearances requires that we have them. Um, and she says yes. She says, it's an everyday fact that appearances and every appearance is grounded in something that doesn't appear. And I gave you that example from Leibniz. That there has to be some reason it appears. That reason a plant appears could be that it has roots, right? The reason that our bodies are here is because we have organs. But those still are appearances, even though you don't see them. They can be pulled out and you can see them. And there must be some non-apparent appearance, some transcendent object that transcends experience, she says. Um, and and she says that's true. I mean, she says Kant was mistaken insofar as he said that the need for transcendent objects or transcendent causes means that the transcendent objects and causes are higher than appearance. There's no reason to think that. You could think that there's a God. That doesn't mean that God is higher than man. It could also be that it's just in order to have man, you need a God or a first cause, but man is the highest. She doesn't think there's a hierarchy implied in this, but she thinks that you do need some first cause. Um, and uh, and so she says there's some sense to the two world theory of being an appearance, but not to the hierarchy. Uh, the source of this hierarchy, though, of being over appearance that she doesn't accept, is what she calls the not at all ordinary experience of the thinking ego. Uh, the thinking, she says, is prior to appearance, right? It is creative on the model of God. When I think, I'm not basing it on sense perception. I'm thinking, in a kind of free way. And Kant based his belief in this Ding an sich, this thing in itself, in the fact that his consciousness of the thinking activity, in his consciousness of the thinking activity, he experienced himself as what he called das Wesen selbst, the essence or the thing in itself, das Ding an sich. And even if in that sheer thinking, nothing of himself is given, right? Because in the pure thinking of myself, I am not a man or white or certain height or certain look. I'm just a thing. I'm just a thinking ego. I'm ageless, sexless, without qualities, without a life story. Um, and I don't appear. I have no appearance. So she says, so in thinking, right, I'm conscious of myself not as I appear to myself, nor as I am in myself, but only in that I am. And this representation is a thought, not an intuition, because I can't ever have an intuition of something that has no appearance. And she turns to a Kant's analogy with dreaming, with thinking, and says that there's a similarity between dreaming and thinking, that both dreaming and thinking withdraw from the world. They never meet the resistance of matter. They don't depend on sense organs. And thus dreams and thinking are super fast, right? Swift like thought, Homer says of certain fast runners in the Trojan War. And we can understand that because thought doesn't encounter any air resistance or any other resistance. It's the fastest thing you can imagine. And so Arendt ends this section 6, basically with the argument that there are things in themselves, Ding an sich, they exist in the intelligible sphere. This is a metaphysical fallacy, right? They don't, Kant spent his whole life on critiquing the critique of pure reason, on limiting reason. And he showed us that there was a limit to what we could know about things in themselves. And yet these fallacies, especially the fallacy of the thinking ego, is not meaningless. He thinks it's quite meaningful. It's one of those fallacies that's unavoidable for beings whose essence is determined by experience, right? We need a fallacy of a thinking ego as human beings because we need to be, insofar as we see things, we need to think that they have some cause. We need to ask, where do they come from? What do they mean? Now, the answer to that could emerge dogmatically, like in a religion, and we could say they're creations of God, but then they're inauthentic. Then the transcendental object is inauthentic. But if the fallacy emerges from the kind of paradox of the fact that as a living being in a world of appearances, we can withdraw from that world and think, and we then in a sense teleport to a world of ageless, sexless, appearingless thinking ego. There's something authentic about that, and even though it is not something that is appearing, it's still real, and that's where she wants to argue that the thinking ego is an authentic semblance. But is it, she asks, also authentic that being is above appearing, right? And the answer she wants to give is no. And this brings us to section 7, the reality and the thinking ego, the Cartesian doubt and the sensus communis. And so there are sort of, as I said, there's in a sense 2 parts to this. The first part is more about reality and the thinking ego, and then under the second section 7, it's more about the sensus communis. The reality and the thinking ego, is struck. She's struck by this idea that reality depends on others, right? I mean, this is part of Arendt's, if we can use a slight word of jargon, I usually don't like to do this, intersubjectivity. She believes that there is no reality without other people, right? I've used this before, but that old philosophical canard or conundrum, right? If a tree falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it, does it make a sound? And people say you can't answer, I don't know how to do it. For her, it's very simple. The answer is no. Because if there aren't other people there, if there's not a plurality, there's no tree, there's no forest, there's no sound. There's no reality without other people. And so she says that both appearing and reality depend on a perceptual faith, a term she takes from Merleau-Ponty, the great French theorist who she relies on quite heavily in these sections. And what Merleau-Ponty means by this idea of perceptual faith is that our certainty about the reality of what we perceive, right? Whether we see a city or a hat or a computer screen, our certainty of that reality depends on the fact that there's other people who see it, and it's acknowledged by them. If only I see it and no one else sees it, I can never be certain of it. And so she says this raises questions about all solipsistic theories, all theories like Descartes, to some extent Plato and others, who say that you know man is simply alone, a thinking ego, a fictitious being, that we live in complete solitude, right? That I can go into the clearing of the forest and think. Yeah, I can. And I can have a very active, thoughtful life and imagination, but I have no sense of the reality of it. I need other people for my world to be real. Um, and she attributes this to a long history, but Descartes is the sort of the radicalization of it. And she says, I talked about this in the human condition, or she says elsewhere, but it's the human condition. And we're talking about the parts of the human condition where she's in the last chapter on the Vita Activa, where she's talking about Descartes. And in that section, um, Descartes offers, in Arendt's words, a solution um, to the problem of uncertainty raised by modern science. Right? What modern science does is teaches us to doubt everything. Right? We're told the sun rises in the morning and sets in the evening. No, right? Science tells us actually the sun stays still, the earth moves around the sun, right? So science unmoors our certainty. And Descartes uh says this is terrible. How do we know anything exists? Because what science teaches us is that everything we see doesn't exist. And so what Descartes says is, I need to find something certain. I need to find something I can hold on to. And he says, the one thing I can hold on to is that I exist because I think. I think, therefore I am. um I can, and if I think and I am, then at least I know that what I think is real. And the only things that I can know are things that I can make myself or think myself. And so for Descartes, the highest idea of knowledge is mathematics, because I can think it, it's in my head, and mathematical formula and universal rules and axioms become more real than the world outside, the appearance. And Arendt calls this common sense in retreat, a phrase by Alfred North Whitehead. Um, Common sense, she says, which is what fitted man into a common world, was now taken out of the common world and put into an inner faculty without any world relationship. In order, what makes things real is not fitting the world into a common world with others, but I can think it according to universal rules and laws. And so in the human condition, she says that Descartes moves the Archimedean point, the point at which I can lever the world, right? The point Archimedes says that if you could get a point far enough from the earth and lever long enough, you could lever the earth. The Archimedean point is the point at which I can control and understand all the world. And Archimedes said the Archimedean point was way out in space, far enough that you could get a big lever and lever the world. Descartes says, no, the Archimedean point is inside myself. It's the ultimate point of certainty and reference in the world is now moved into my head, into my mind. And everything that's real has to fit with my reason, my rationality, my mathematical knowledge. And Arendt says that the Cartesian solipsism frees man from any given reality altogether. And this retreat from reality into solipsism, she says, it's an old idea of philosophy. It begins with Parmenides and Plato, but for them, it's only the very few who leave the world, the real world, for the world of ideas. But with Descartes, it becomes a more common experience. Um, the 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 sense that science has unmoored us is now widespread and common, and we all now think, oh, my reason, my internal reason is what I know for certain. I don't know anything. I mean, you can see this on some level, just in the world of politics today. We start to distrust, right? The common world, all authorities. We distrust, um, anyone who, peer review. We distrust the scientists at the Center for Disease Control, or we distrust the Environmental Protection Agency, and people start coming up with their own fantasies, right? And my fantasies are logical because I've thought them through, and they're more true than the real world. She says that it never occurred to Descartes that without fellow creatures to assure him that what he perceived was also perceived by them, he would never himself of his own reality by any intensity of cognition. He didn't realize that you can't even be sure of of yourself if you hadn't had other people who were sure of things in common that taught you the idea of knowing, things, of a common world. Reality is based on a common world with others, but in some sense, so is even and since reality itself is based on a common world with others, I can't even think of the reality of myself in a solipsism without the common world with others. And so this thinking ego, this Cartesian res cogitans, this fictitious creature, bodiless, senseless, she says, would not even know that there's such a thing as reality, because it would never have existed in a common world with others. And this, she says at the end of the first section 7, that Descartes moves us to a type of certitude, I think, therefore I am, that will actually never tell us anything or bring us back to the there is of the world. And yet, the thinking ego, which has no reality, and can never reach common sense and destroys common sense, she says, is something real. We then move on to this second part of section 7, where she says that the sense of reality, right, this reality that we get from other people, carries with it a prior indication of realness. We can't even think of reality without other people. And here she makes a very interesting small comment about art, right? Art, she says, right? If you make a painting or create a song or make a dance or a theater, work, what you do is you take an everyday object, right? You take a church and you paint it, or you take a ritual and you turn it into a dance. You transform that everyday object, you tear it out of its context, its common sense context, you de-realize it, and you make it do whatever you want. You make it an object for thinking or beauty. And art, in that sense, transforms things out of reality into thinking things. This, for her, is because reality is really guaranteed by a worldly context that others perceive as I do, and that my senses work together to give me a context of the whole world. And this idea is what she calls the sensus communis, or the common sense. It's the sixth sense, she calls it. The one sense that fits the 5 senses of the common world and into a world shared with others. Common sense guarantees reality in a world of illusion by fitting these 5 senses into a common world shared with others in 3 ways. First, all 5 senses have the same object in common. When I see or hear or smell or touch or taste, if I have to, the hat, right? It's the same object. They all are about the hat. Secondly, is that the members of the same species, so in our case, all human species, have the context in common of living in a world as human beings with things. Excuse me 1 second. No, come back later, please. And third, all members of the species, while they have their own perspectives, agree on the identity of the object. Hold on 1 second. Sorry about that. So all these three reasons that the five senses have the same object in common, that the members have the same context, and all members from their perspectives agree on the identity of the object, this together gives us a sensation of reality, of realness. Now, this realness, she says, is an inner sense, right? It's not actually, you don't touch or see or taste or smell or hear from it. Um, uh, and in that sense, it's sort of like thinking because it's inner. But thinking is different because it deals with invisibles, not with objects, whereas this sixth sense still deals with an object. Um, the common sense still belongs to the world of appearance. But thinking moves beyond the world of appearance to concepts like justice, truth, and courage. Thus, thinking and the thinking ego can never reach the common sense world, right? And thinking, because it subjects everything to doubt, has no connection to reality, or no necessary or matter of fact connection to reality. Thinking destroys common sense and destroys our trust in reality. Um, Descartes' error was that he overcomes doubt by fully withdrawing from reality. And there's clearly a danger in too much thinking, and it's a danger that Arendt points to her whole life. It's one of the reasons she thought that many intellectuals during the Second World War were so susceptible to ideologies and to Nazi or Stalinist thinking because they withdrew from common sense. And thinking in this withdraws from the feeling of reality given by common sense. Um, we can see this in everyday people, right? You get lost in thought, you become absent-minded, you walk into a door, or you lose track of time. There's the famous story of Thales, right? The Greek thinker who got so lost looking up at the sky and thinking that he walked and fell into a well. It happens to everyone who thinks, but it happens more to professional thinkers. And that's one of the reasons Arendt is so wary of professional thinkers, especially when they try and enter politics or enter the world, because these professional thinkers are divorced from reality, and often get caught up in fantasies and ideologies that have no bearing in reality. And yet she wants to say that this thinking ego, this thing that can be divorced from reality, that is nowhere, is an authentic semblance. It's something that we all can know, all can experience. Even though it's at war with common sense, it is something essential and unavoidable and meaningful for a human world that is based in experience. So that's her basic approach in these chapters. The next chapter, the one we'll read in 2 weeks, is on science and common sense, and she's going to say that science is more connected to common sense than thinking is, although it also raises dangers for common sense as well through the idea of progress. But we'll get there. All of this is within this chapter on appearing and appearance, which is about this fundamental difficulty about how does thinking, something so meaningful and so important to the human person, how does it appear in the world, and can it? And these are the kind of worries that Arendt is engaged in here. Okay, I'm going to stop, and I look forward to a discussion. I see the chat is quite active. As usual, that's great. Please, enjoy the chat, talk to each other, make points, and be respectful. You can also, of course, go down to the reaction button and click on raise hand and engage the conversation here. Thanks very much. Jason, you're up.
Predicate this with I haven't been this excited in a long time. Um, I have so much writing to do now. It's shocking. The um, the breakthrough here, and I nearly caught it on our last read through, was the page 50 to 51 of the McCarthy edition, where she talks about common sense and she makes it very much a part of context. And that suddenly, that penny finally dropped today. I've been writing about the sense of place for 8 or 9 years now. And everything else that we've been reading about today and the rest of these concepts all mirror into an idea of the locality of experience. And that if you're not actually going to Argentina, you're not actually experiencing Argentina. And you can read about, amazing places all your life, and I have, but I've also wanted to travel, and I've wanted to eat the foods, and I've wanted to get lost in these foreign cities. And that's because you can't actually experience them without actually going there. You can't read about it. So that common sense, when I read this now, when I just say local sense or the sense of the place, everything falls into a line now for me. And that, just I put I copy clipped the reading into the chat, um, so that there's and that all the overthinking of it is when it starts to dissolve, even after you've been to a place, even after you've eaten the empanada. You can't overthink it, or else if you begin to dissolve your haptic memories of that experience. So that's a breakthrough for me, that it's really made a lot of my stuff fall into place. And it's um I don't know if I'll get to sleep tonight. Thank you.
Well, I hope you get some sleep, but I'm glad you had that experience of a breakthrough. Those are wonderful things. Um, you know, I think what you say is super important. And I'm thinking of Kant. I mean, some of you know this. He never left his town of Königsberg, um, and yet his mind was quite active, and he certainly could read about Persia and France. And I understood what you meant, Jason. It's not that you can't read about Argentina. You can, and you can be given all sorts of amazing ideas about Argentina when you read uh, Jose Luis Borges, right? Um, Strange ideas of Argentina by reading Borges. Um, and and you can have all sorts of knowledge, and you can, um, but it's almost infinite because there's no limits on it. It's the swiftness of thought, or in Kant's terms, the Hurtigkeit of des Denkens. Um, and so there's a kind of unmooredness of reality, which is, and this is the opposite side of it, right, Jason, is that unmooredness of reality, that swiftness of thought, that susceptibility to ideology and to unreality and to the loss of common sense is also real. That's that's the sort of paradox here, that in a human being tied to a real common sense world, there's also a thinking ego that is almost necessary as part of what it means to be a meaningful human being, which frees us from the real world, which allows us to think beyond common sense reality, and is also what allows us, in some sense, to change and inspire and move common sense reality in new ways. You can't live. Human beings would not be human beings if we only lived in common sense reality, if we only thought of Argentina when we were in Argentina, right? If we only thought about, um, fascism if we lived in fascism. Part of being human is to be able to um to really think without the moorings of reality. And that's what she means by the fact that it's an authentic semblance. It is a semblance, but it's authentic. It's part of the meaningfulness of who we are.
I also see that it's really clearly that the appearing force of it is that we actually have to meet reality halfway, that it is a negotiation. And yeah, we have to bring the ego to that equation.
John, you're up next.
Hi, Roger. Thank you. I want to pick up on what Jason was saying and a word that he used. And the word he used was experience. And that's what interests me. Um, we have sense experience, our five senses. So you go to a foreign city and you experience that city. But it's not just your five senses. I mean, the smells, the sounds, the tastes, the textures, and so on. It's not just sense experience. It's an emotional experience. That is to say, you're responding positively or negatively to the various sights and sounds and so on. You're making judgments and evaluations. That's familiar. That's not familiar. What the hell does that mean? And so on. And so the whole idea of having an experience is a total thing. It's sense experience plus. Now, into that mix is also thinking. And a word that I haven't heard yet so far is the word reflection. That is, you reflect on the experience that you have. You have that experience, you remember it. That evening, you go to your bedroom, you lie down, and you start reflecting on the day. And that reflection is a kind of thinking. So what I guess what I'm saying is that the word experience involves both sense experience, evaluation, making judgments, and thinking about your experience to even develop a concept. Say the fundamental difference between Beijing and New York, all right, and the culture under it. That's all I'm saying, just to expand the notion of experience.
Thank you, John. That's helpful and fair. We talked last week, our last session, about the difference between the soul and the mind, between feelings and thinking, right? Um, and so yeah, you have your five senses, you have your common sense, which fits you into the common world. Then you also have feelings, disgust, beauty, reverence, joy, happiness, anger. Um, and then you have thinking about those feelings that tries to make choices about them, some kind of reflection in some way, actually, that begins to sort of determine how you present yourself in this new place, in this new experience. Whether you're going to present yourself as happier or less happy or more happy or upset. And so yeah, all of this certainly goes into the quality of experience. I think you're right. Um, you know, uh, Arendt, is asking this. I mean, what she's interested in here, right, is to what extent this idea of thinking, which can be completely abstracted to some degree from experience, is still a meaningful or not part of human life. And she's trying to argue that it is, that there's, even though it's this sort of thing outside of experience, um, it is still an authentic, meaningful part of being human. So yeah, I think it's an important, but and so and that our experience also includes our experience outside of reality as someone who thinks about reality. And we have to include that in it as well. Okay, thank you. Vigdis.
Yeah, I have a couple of comments and also a question. I was thinking, I think it's so fascinating how she focuses on appearances and in a way establishes the world's reality for all those things that appears in this world, and in a way in relation to our perceptions, the way we perceive things. That means with our senses. And also was thinking, I have a cat and I have a dog, and I also have a lot of birds living around here. And I'm quite sure that both the cat, the dog, and the birds actually relate to the same objects, all the material objects, they all relate to it, probably in very different ways. And also, it seems like, for instance, the dog, when I walk it, it relates to the material objects in the same way other dogs relate to it, not the same way as I do. But that's just as a kind of funny observation, though. Uh, but what I also like very much is her relation to experience and the relation between thinking and experience, as she always talks about this. We have to think from experience, and also to kind of not lose sight of experience, because then we end up in all kind of theories and fantasies. So the role of experience, I think, is important. My question, though, is what fascinates me a lot, and that is language and the role of language in this. And she talks about, she says, this is in the critical edition, page 56, where she says, and if language, in addition to its treasures of words for things given to the senses, perceived by them and used by us in communication about them with each other, did not offer to us such thought words, technically called concepts as justice, truth, courage, divinity, and the like, which are indispensable even in ordinary speech, we would indeed lack all tangible evidence for the thinking activity, and hence might be just in concluding with early Wittgenstein that language is the extension of the organism. So there is this kind of, I was thinking, in a way, from a common sense, and there is something in the human world. We create language, and we know very well that different languages is important. If you go to a place where people talk a language you don't talk, you're completely lost. You can't communicate with them any longer. But it seems to me that from a perception, we have a kind of labeling different things in the world. And then comes also in language these thought words that seems kind of evaluating things. They have this aspect of evaluation that seems to be very specific for human beings. And I think the relation between all this, I don't know if you can say anything, what your thoughts about it. To me, it's just so exciting to think about these things and the role language play, and how we can kind of, look at the world, think about it, be critical and evaluate it, and think when the words we use don't match the world we live in. All these.
Thank you, Vigdis. Yes, the idea of language is essential here, right? So we talked last session about, again, mind and soul, and said that in the soul you have these feelings which are inexpressible in language, right? And in thinking, we make them expressible. And what this means is that even though thinking, which can be at war with common sense and subject everything to doubt that it gets a hold of, right? Even though thinking can be so destructive, it's still connected to the common sense world through language. So when we say of thinking, swift like thought, right? We're connecting thinking to running, to something we know from common sense. Or other things of swiftness. The wind is swift. These are things we feel and are part of our senses and our common sense. And so what she says is, and well, she's going to talk much more about this in sections 12 and 13, where she's talking about language and metaphor as the bridge that connects the world and thinking. That the fact that thinking, this withdrawal, this invisible, this semblance, authentic semblance, but semblance, the fact that thinking still has to happen in language, and this may be controversial for some people, right? But what she's going to say is you can't think outside language. You can feel outside of language. But once you start thinking, even though you're in a solipsistic enterprise, you're not fully in a solipsistic enterprise, because you thinking in language bridges you over to the common world and thus to other people. And that's going to be one of the more, I think, powerful aspects of her analysis of thinking. So in this first part of the book on thinking, she's focusing on thinking as something that is opposed to common sense, opposed to reality, and thus, in some sense, at least at its most extreme level, solipsistic. And she says it's a fallacy, and yet it's an authentic fallacy. It's something we all understand. But in the next book, the next part of the book on thinking, she's going to start to pull us back and say, actually, thinking is still in some way connected to the real world. And language is going to be the bridge that brings us back. So you're thinking ahead, and we'll get there. Okay? Hannah.
Well, I was going to ask something else, but I wanted to make a brief comment about language. I kept thinking of abstract versus concrete language when you were speaking earlier. And also, Murray Edelman wrote a book called The Symbolic Uses of Politics, in which he talks about God and devil terms. Or maybe it wasn't Edelman who said God and devil terms. That could have been Larson, but God and devil terms, and in terms of persuading people. When we rhetoricians, we teach students, when you want to persuade, like when politicians want to persuade, but they don't want to get pinned down, they use abstract language like justice, freedom, things like that. Justice, freedom, things you can't pin down, versus concrete language. And these are all very, concrete versus abstract, and God versus devil terms are really critical tools that are used in language and in politics. I just wanted to throw that in from my area of training. But I wanted to ask you, Roger, and this is probably as sophomoric as anybody can get, and I apologize, but I wanted to just briefly tell you this sort of very unsettling experience I'm having. So I call myself a true centrist politically. I found it very painful to vote this time because I didn't like Kamala Harris, but of course I did vote for her because morally I felt there was no other choice. So I voted for her, but it was very, very difficult for me. My husband didn't vote, which I don't believe in. I believe you have a sacred duty to vote. So I voted for her. And then since Trump has come into office, very briefly, I'll say that I've experienced more horror than I've ever had in my life, except in my long and in-depth study of the Holocaust and the fact that my mother's I'm a second generation survivor. So I've had feelings of true horror. And then the weirdest thing happens to me sometimes because I read a lot, and since I'm a centrist, the other day, I go like, okay, you can't just sit there and be horrified. And it's just not, it can't be. So I start listening to people like Niall Ferguson and Victor Davis Hanson, who, and I listened the other day to Victor Davis Hanson, and he made this incredible amount of sense about um, why it really is very true that Europe hasn't been pulling its weight, and all these sorts of things that, I don't want to go into the details. So what I'm asking you, Roger, is what does this mean, this thinking? I'm doing this thinking and being very agonized, uh, going in these totally opposite directions because I'm trying to find a ground that's very, find a ground. And sometimes I feel it's so shifting. Is this any related to what she's talking about, or am I just being a total sophomoric idiot? Thank you.
Thanks, Hannah. No, I think it's very related. It's a great question. We'll get there, right? There's a long book on thinking, and we're very at the very beginning of it. But many of you know, because we've talked about it many times in this group, our idea that one understanding of thinking is to let your mind go wandering, right? To what she calls the Erweiterungsdenkungsart, the widening or enlarged way of thinking. And what it means is, she says, it's not that you have to go and listen or talk to Niall Ferguson or the other gentleman you mentioned, or whoever it may be, Tucker Carlson or Donald
Oh,
Trump.
God, please no. Yeah.
But you have to imagine and put yourself in the position of trying to understand their perspective. And she says that doesn't mean you have to agree with it, right? But you have to try and understand it. And the more perspectives you can bring in from the left, the right, the center, the crazy, the this, the that, the more you'll see the weaknesses of your own perspective, but maybe also the strengths of it. And the more you'll be able to make a judgment that aspires to not just be your personal judgment, but to be a public judgment, a common judgment, a real judgment of the world.
Yes.
And so part of the claim here, right, is that thinking, which is this nearly solipsistic semblance, error, illusion, is an authentic experience of human beings that in some way might allow us to actually build a common world, because it forces us outside of our own prejudices and our own perspective into the need to try and understand as many people as can and articulate what we think in our own judgment is a public common world. Now, someone else may do that and come up with a different common world, and then we're going to have to try and reconcile ourselves to each other. But thinking and the freedom from our perspective is absolutely essential to the kind of politics that Arendt imagines, which is one in which we build a common world together. So I think you're absolutely right to raise these questions. Whether you have to listen to Tucker Carlson or Donald Trump or Niall Ferguson, or whether you just have to think like them, is an interesting question. I mean, and this it's a question that has meant a lot in my life, right? I mean, as some of you know, I've invited a lot of speakers from both the far left and the far right to the Arendt Center. And some people have said, well, why are you giving these people a platform? And part of my argument is that, it's one thing to simply say, oh, I read, Steve Bannon, or I read Mark Youngin, or I read some of these people. But when you read them, it's very easy to just sort of say, oh, they're wrong. But when you have them come and speak and they talk and you say, oh, you're wrong. And they say, well, here's why I think you're wrong. You actually, it makes it, I think, easier to have a conversation in which you actually are pushed to widen your own thinking. And I think it's important to actually fully engage with people who have different perspectives from ourselves, because that's the only way to begin on both sides to build some sort of a common understanding, a common sense world with others. So I think it's an important point and question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Jim.
Yeah, I want your help in unpacking a passage in the McCarthy edition. It's at the bottom of page 51 onto 52.
All right, that's since I don't have the McCarthy edition in front of me because I'm in Argentina, Jim, can you just tell me what section it is and about where it's in it?
In section 7, the paragraph begins, these remarks and suggestions.
All right, just give me one. Is it near the end or beginning?
One sentence into that paragraph.
Oh, okay. It's on page 56 in the critical edition. So go ahead. Thank you.
So what I'm directing here, I'm interested in a couple of things. Like, one thing I'm interested in is the language that she's using. That is, she's playing with Paul, the Apostle Paul, in this reference to the stumbling block. And the other thing is, it helps us understand what common sense is. And that is that usually people talk about common sense as if it's some kind of like intersubjective political sense. And she says something quite different here. This is what she says, quote, whatever thinking can reach and whatever it may achieve, it is precisely reality as given to common sense in a sheer bareness that remains forever beyond its grasp, indissoluble into thought trains, the stumbling block that alerts them and on which they founder an affirmation or negation. Thought processes, unlike common sense, can be physically located in the brain, but nevertheless transcends all biological data, be they functional or morphological in Portman's sense. Common sense, on the contrary, and the feeling of realness belong to our biological apparatus, period, unquote. Okay? So there we have a fairly bald hint about what common sense is. A feeling of realness belongs to our biological apparatus, which seems to contradict a lot of the talk about Arendt's common sense that I hear. What do you think about this passage? And can you help me make some sense of this and this debate about intersubjectivity, or this talk about intersubjectivity in relation to common sense?
Thanks, Jim. So she's here engaged in an attempt to distinguish a kind of her views from a more analytic school of philosophy, represented by people like Charles Sanders Peirce and Thomas Thorson, right? And what she's saying is that these folks, right, assume that thought processes are not different from common sense reasoning, and yet she wants to say that they are. And so you've quoted these passages where she's saying, that thinking, whatever it is, whatever it can reach and whatever it may achieve, it can't grasp common sense. Okay, what does that mean? It means that thinking, which is withdrawn from the world, and is to some degree in this no place, even though it still takes place in language and thus is bridges into common sense and the real world. It's it's never going to be able to grasp that sheer there-ness of the world and its reality. That the world and the reality in its biological there-ness and its physicality is indissoluble into thought trains. You see a rock or a hat or a person, and you can describe that person, and talk about how, what they look like and what they do and your impression of how they think, and you can write a million pages and you're never going to get the fullness of that person. I think that's the point here, right? That thought processes, in contrast to common sense, they may be located in the brain, but they're not in the real world. So what's the point here? She wants to say that thinking is not only divorced from reality to some degree, but can be at odds with and even antagonistic to reality, insofar as we say of somebody that they are white or Asian or black or gay or straight or whatever it is. We are committing what Hegel called the fallacy of abstraction, or Alfred North Whitehead called the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. We're taking one aspect of them and letting it stand in for the wholeness of them, and that thinking is an insufficient way of trying to grasp reality. Reality always exceeds thinking. Common sense is beyond cannot be reduced to thinking. It includes feelings, it includes sensing, touching. I mean, I think John, I think, was asking about this before, that all this experience that sort of surpasses thinking. Now, thinking can use metaphors and language and try and grasp it, but it can't fully get it. What this means for Arendt and her understanding of common sense is that, at least in our world of politics and in judgment, which we get to much later, right? Thinking is a prerequisite for it. As I was just speaking with Hannah about, right? It breaks down barriers. It allows us to think outside our own perspective, but it's not going to build a common world. Judgment, where we try and make a claim about the world that others will recognize, and what she will call, in making our judgment, if I say that Joe is a good person in spite of everything, right? And all the negatives that we can list about Joe, I'm trying to woo others to my opinion. If I say, Trump, in Hannah's words, is filling me with horror, right? Even though maybe I think, there's some good, Victor Davis or whatever his name is, says that there are things that Trump says which are true. I'm trying to woo others to my judgment. I'm trying to build a common world with them. And that's common sense. Thinking doesn't build a common world. Judging does. Thinking can free me from my limited perspective. Thinking can teach me to destroy the common world. Thinking can also, is still connected to a common world through language, but thinking is not going to build a common world. That's where judging will come in. Is that what you were asking, Jim? I'm not sure I understood it 100%, but I think I got it. But you tell me.
Yeah, I get a lot of that, but just a comment about the point about common sense being part of our biological apparatus. What I notice is people tend to like associate common sense as judgment, and you seem to be suggesting that a little bit at the end, right? But she clearly says common sense is part of our biological apparatus, which means it's not free. It means it's part of cognition. It means it's really not part of judgment as people seem to sometimes act like it is.
So common sense, when she says common sense and the feeling of realness still belong to our biological apparatus, and common sense reasoning could indeed very well bear the same relation to reality as biological evolution does to environment. What I think she means is that our common sense is still built on our five senses, right, which are biological. I mean, I don't know if that's controversial or not. I mean, is seeing biological? I don't know. There's obviously a mental element to seeing, right? But to some degree, it is. Um, uh, and so she ties common sense to a kind of biological apparatus insofar as it's the sixth sense that ties the five more biological senses together and fits it into a common world with others. Judgment is not biological, right? Um, uh, in that sense, it's not tied to the five senses. And I don't think it's tied to common sense. But judgment is an attempt, is a political virtue or act insofar as, and she thinks that the critique of judgment is Kant's political philosophy or secret political philosophy, insofar as that in judgment, we seek to woo others to our common sense viewpoint. And we try and make a judgment that will persuade others to our common sense viewpoint. And so it's not, I don't think it's the same as common sense, although it's certainly related to it. Okay. George.
Okay, well, just to continue on that, whenever I get confused about thinking and judgment and Kant, I go to my favorite explanation of Kant, and maybe you can comment on it, which is Gombravich's book from Philosophy in 6 hours and 15 minutes, where he explains everything. And
Whose book?
Gombravich, Vital Gombravich.
I don't
And
know.
would he explain, and I just want to comment, because it's quite clear to me. He says, look, the thing about Kant is that he says with judgment especially, but with thinking and judgment, you have to start someplace. You have to have an a priori. And he says you have to have a conscience behind a conscience that tells you where do you start. And he says where you start, according to him, is with two things, space and time. And they're really not things. Space is something that is just there, and it allows you to place things and relations together. Time is something that lets you tell whether the relations are permanent or not, or how permanent they are. And Kant starts with those two things, with space and time. And he goes on from that, and he really starts off with deduction. And then he goes on to experience. And he says, and he does this in a very, very systematic way. And where you go into pure reason and practical reason that you were talking just about. And both those things allow you to judge. Now, he says, and this all worked out very, very nicely until the philosophers after Kant started mess things up. And we now have no real understanding of space and time. and it's all messed up now. And this is why we're talking so much about all this, because we really can't set up a thing that could have worked very well and could have set up sort of good permanent things, and the 20th century messed all that up.
Okay, George, I mean, you're giving us an interesting account of the transcendental intuitions in space and time in the Critique of Pure Reason. I have to admit, I'm not sure I understand the connection to the texts we're reading here.
Well,
But
it's about judgment.
okay, yeah.
That is, what do we base judgment now with what we know about space and time, which where we see really the basis for making judgments in the past.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have much to say about that. I'm not sure I can. I mean, I mean, in the critique of judgment, judgment is based in a kind of sensus communis. I'd have to go back. I'd have to sit down and talk to you much longer about it to understand that question.
And
I apologize.
I don't want to take up too much time.
Yeah.
I just thought I'd bring it up as a something to
Okay,
think.
I'll take it as a comment. I appreciate it. Haley, we get the last question. Oh no, there's two more, Haley and Francesco.
Thank you. I am thinking about this authentic semblance and then authentic political action, and I can't work out if they're the same thing. So does Arendt mean them to be the same thing? Because they both seem to be the manifestation of our uniqueness. So we appear as our unique selves through authentic semblance and through authentic political action. So are they the same thing? And then I'm thinking, if they are the same thing, then that to me poses a problem then when Arendt talks about political action as being spontaneous and that. So
Haley,
that's
I don't know what authentic political action is.
okay. So sorry, so Arendt's concept of political action.
Ah,
Sorry, that's how I word
okay.
it. That's how,
Well,
sorry.
political action for Arendt, right, is that one acts, and one doesn't control the way one's action is understood or
Yeah, so
perceived. You jump into the public fray, and you may think you're doing one thing, but it may turn out that you have other impacts and other effects. And so you act into what she calls the public space, the web of appearances, right?
yeah.
And you and your action matters, and you come to matter in the world, but you don't control your story. And that's an important part of her understanding of action. But she doesn't call that authentic. But I understand you're saying, okay, Arendtian action is what I take you to be saying.
Yes,
Um,
yeah.
but that's very different from what she's interested in here. I mean,
Okay.
the connection, I guess, if you wanted to draw one, is that action is what speaking and acting in public is what allows us to be meaningful, right? To live meaningful lives. And so they provide our action is not true, right? She says the criteria for action is not true or false. It's whether it's meaningful or not meaningful. Similarly, the thinking ego is a kind of authentic semblance. That's not true or false, but it is meaningful. And in that sense, there's a connection between them. But it's not, but it doesn't mean, but I mean, I don't think the thinking ego is a political, is an action. It's not an action in the public world. In fact, it's the opposite. It's the retreat from the public world. It's almost the antithesis. I mean, I guess what we could interestingly say is that you can be meaningful as a human being through action in the world of appearances, but you can also be meaningful and find meaning in the withdrawal from the world of appearances in thinking. Now, of course, when you withdraw from the world of appearances and you find meaning in thinking, nobody knows about it. And it's a kind of solipsism. And yet, and so usually that kind of action, the activity of thinking, remember, and that's the second origin of this book, where she says that in some sense, thinking is, this is the quote from Cato the Elder, right at the very end of the book in the Human Condition, and which she then starts with again in the introduction here, which is that her whole distinction between thinking and between the vita contemplativa and the vita activa in the Human Condition was based on the idea that thinking is simply a solipsism, right? That thinking is a withdrawal. And yet there's this famous quote from Cato the Elder, which says that I am never more active than when I am thinking. And so part of what's going on in this book, and we haven't got, I've given you some foreshadowing, right? But part of what's going on in this book is that thinking is seen as an activity, not simply as a withdrawal. And as an activity, there will be times when thinking can bring us back into the world, right? One way it does that is through language and metaphor. But another way it can do that is when everyone else is acting in ways that are unthinking, thoughtless, our thinking stands out and makes them stop and think, and potentially our thinking then appears in the world as our non-participation in collective ideologies and fantasies. So I don't know. I hope that's helpful. But I I don't think there's a direct connection between authentic semblance and authentic action, but I think you can make these kind of interesting connections. Francesca, you'll get the last question. Francesca, you there? You got to unmute. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. I have a question. In the human condition, Arendt says vita contemplativa is not vita activa. And in the life of the mind, she begins to understand what is thinking. She wrote, Eichmann was unable to think, was stupid. So is her interest of appearance in the world because we have to think the appearance, but not thinking in the same way of philosophy? This point I don't understand very well. It's a difficulty for me. Can you explain, please?
Well, I think that's similar to the question, what I was just saying at the end of answering the last question, maybe not. She does, what she says is that in the tradition, the thinking activity is contemplative and passive, right? The vita contemplativa. And in the modern age, in the scientific age, thinking is thought of as mathematical and non-empirical. That the mind simply plays with itself. And so she had said in the Human Condition, I want to look at the other side of the human condition, not thinking, contemplation and passivity, but action. But she says that in this book, I'm looking at thinking from a completely different point of view, right? In which is a point of view that she'd always been fascinated with, which was Cato's, right? in which he said, never is a man more active than when he does nothing. Never is he less alone than it was when he is by himself. And the idea is that there's a kind of activity to thinking. What do we do when we think? What is the activity of thinking? And that's what she's here engaged in, trying to understand. And it's not that Eichmann was stupid. She doesn't think he's a stupid man. She thinks he's a thoughtless man, and she thinks those two things are different. He may have been a very good bureaucrat, not stupid, but he didn't think. What is thinking? What is the activity of thinking? Well, it's thinking from the perspective of other people. It's widening your own perspective. It's pushing yourself to a broader and hopefully more public and eventually common sense view that you can woo other people to. I hope that helps, Francesca. Okay, thank you all very much. I think we take 1 week off next week when I'm going to be not in Argentina, but in Uruguay giving a series of lectures. If you're in the area, come join us. Otherwise, we meet again in 2 weeks to read section 8 on science and thinking and common sense. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Thanks very much.